Thank you, Dr. Hebda, for your very evocative remarks and for really helping us to focus on the fundamental nature of the problems at hand here. I think it's fair to say that climate change is making it impossible to ignore the stresses on the land in BC, as you pointed out, if we're paying attention, that is. Now, from a legal perspective, the question to ask is, how well are those stresses, coupled with the impacts of climate change, going to be managed under our existing legal framework? The answer, unfortunately, appears to be not that well. Our existing legal framework, as Jessica has mentioned at the outset, is designed to facilitate resource extraction. For the most part, it was developed long before climate change was seen as a defining challenge, and before we really came to grips with the idea that there are limits on how much we can take from nature without facing any consequences. We do, of course, have protected areas in BC, about 15% of the available lands, but we know from scientists like Dr. Hebda that this 15% isn't enough to ensure adaptation to climate change impacts and resilience for nature and communities in BC. So we very urgently need to take the message that Dr. Hebda has so eloquently delivered this evening and apply it. As he's pointed out, our vital life support systems hang in the balance. Now, at West Coast Environmental Law, we would suggest that there are two main areas that need to be examined in terms of dealing with these issues at a legal and strategic level. First of all, we need to look at the whole picture of our activities on the land, not just project by project or with respect to the exploitation of a single resource. We need to examine the cumulative effects of all our activities on the land, across landscapes and through time. Now, this makes intuitive sense, I think, that we would need to have the whole picture in view when we're making decisions about land use, but in effect, this would be a relatively new approach for BC. We have a plethora of laws and regulations and orders and directives, together creating more than 260, that's 260, different provincial rights, tenures, interests, and designations. But they're in effect somewhat like a big sprawling mass of law. We need a way to tune these rights and interests, if you will, so that they'll work in harmony and help us achieve the vital outcomes that we're talking about. So more specifically, what might this entail? Well, to start with, and as Dr. Hebda has just explained, we need a better understanding of where our ecological thresholds lie. What does nature need to be resilient and adaptable? We also need to look at the performance of our existing laws and designations in keeping us within those ecological limits. What have we got already that will work? And then finally, what we really need is a mechanism for assessing and comparing different future scenarios, so different patterns of activities, different levels of activities, and helping us decide what to do. We need a way to coordinate assessment and decision-making at this strategic level. Now, the bottom line is that while we have relatively little direct control over climate change impacts, aside from reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we can control the impacts of human activity. And we need to take a more sophisticated and precautionary approach to those things that we can control. Now, on the positive side, we do have a legacy of strategic planning in BC that Minister Bell referred to in his welcome. But I would flag that there are a few shortcomings that we should take special note of. First of all, climate change impacts and adaptation weren't taken into account in the strategic land use planning. There's no value assigned to forest carbon. Those plans aren't legally able to guide non-forestry resource industries. In effect, political considerations have trumped science. We had politically established caps on protected areas, for example, and at the landscape level, we had caps on measures to conserve biodiversity and species based on the impact of these measures on timber supply. Now, another thing that is missing for the most part was government-to-government engagement with First Nations in the development of these plans. Although we do have important exceptions with more recent land use planning processes, we have the innovative and visionary models emerging from coastal First Nations in the Great Bear Rainforest, as well as the Gitnao that we're going to hear more about just after me. And so folks in BC are already grappling with some of these issues and formulating solutions. Indeed, at West Coast Environmental Law, we're of the view that we should be specifically thinking about how to enable these models in British Columbia in our provincial law. The second main area that we need to look at is to consider the following. If economic drivers, that is the resource-based economy and its corresponding legal framework, have created many of our existing problems, Is it possible to redirect economic drivers to help safeguard nature and at the same time support community well-being? So what I'm talking about, of course, is the green economy that stresses the interdependence of human economies and natural ecosystems and assigns a value to natural capital, which doesn't exist in our present legal framework. Climate change has really helped to drive the green economy around the world by assigning a price to carbon primarily. Now, in BC, local communities that rely on traditional economic activities like resource extraction, we know are facing some tough times now and in the future. So what can we do to support the development of the green economy as an alternative for these communities? In BC, we already have overarching legal frameworks to address climate change with respect to greenhouse gases associated with burning fossil fuels. But we're really lagging behind in terms of nature and climate strategies that could potentially help rural BC communities and First Nations. We know that BC forests are vast carbon storehouses. It's estimated that 18 billion tons of carbon are stored in our living forests. But what are the carbon financing opportunities that are available for BC that would involve putting a value on this natural carbon and protecting the forests where the natural carbon is found? Well, carbon offsets are one option that's had the most airplay so far, but looking into the future, there are further options for carbon financing that we can consider as well. For example, we might look at using some of the revenue from allowances auctioned in the forthcoming cap-and-trade system, for example. Now, to make this work from an environmental perspective, we need rigorous carbon accounting, we need real climate benefits, but if it's done right, we have the opportunity to promote conservation and sustainable forest management, and at the same time potentially create benefits for other economic activities that rely on the protection of natural resources like fisheries and tourism. So going forward, there are these two main areas where we need some action. We need to look at cumulative effects. We need to come up with a mechanism to manage those cumulative effects and inform it with strong science-based analysis. And we also need to look at how we can enable the green economy and recognize ecosystem values within our economy. Now, we'll probably also need to consider new land use designations. I expect I'm running out of time at this point, but we can talk more about this in the discussion. We can improve our existing resource-specific regimes for sure, but it will be likely hard to get overall the impact that we need working with deeply within the system that we have. We need to look at how we can implement nature and climate objectives at a more strategic level. Now, there is some good news here. Work has already begun in BC, taking into account climate change impacts. We have the Species at Risk Task Force. We have First Nations land use planning processes. We have a number of other initiatives, the Water Act modernization. So there are opportunities here for efficiencies and enhanced effectiveness if these processes are informed by consistent science and policy direction. And I guess I'd just like to say in conclusion that the challenges are urgent and not inconsiderable, but if we can muster the political will, there is a way forward.